The third component of exposure, aside from aperture and shutter, is ISO. So let's talk a little bit about what ISO is and how you can control it to improve your photography. First of all, ISO stands for International Standards Organization. It's an organization that sets guidelines for measurements, but more important than what ISO stands for is what it does. It's a measurement of the camera's sensitivity to light. So to understand this, let's step back a little bit to film days, back when we had rolls of 35mm film that we'd load in our cameras in advance from frame to frame. You can go to the store, go to Walgreens or CVS or wherever, and buy rolls of film in ASA values of 100, 200, 400, even 800, depending on the type of photos you're going to be shooting. So if you're going out for a day at the beach, you probably buy ISO 100 or 200 film. Those were good for outdoors. If you're going to be photographing indoors, like you got a birthday party come up, you'd buy 400 or 800 film. And that value, that ASA value, is the exact same as modern digital cameras with an ISO value. What that number is, 100, 200, 400, and so on, is a measure of how sensitive the film was back in film days, or in nowadays, how sensitive the digital film is, the digital sensor on the camera, how sensitive that is to light. ASA 100 film was not very sensitive to light, so it needed a ton of light in order to get a good picture. That's why it was good for outdoors, because when you step outside, you got the sun, the brightest light source of all, pouring down light. So you don't need a really sensitive piece of film in order to get a lot of light on it. Indoors, or in low light scenarios, you need film that's more sensitive to light. So you'd go and you'd buy ASA 400 or 800 film, and the chemicals in that film were more sensitive to particles of light hitting it, so you didn't need as much light. Well, the same thing happens today with digital cameras. ASA from film days has now been replaced with ISO, but the measurement is the same. It means the same thing. On your camera, most cameras have an ISO range, most modern cameras have an ISO range of 100 to 6400. Some are 100 to 3200, and depending on the type of camera you have, those numbers may vary. At ISO 100, the camera needs more light to take a photo with a given exposure. At ISO 400, 800, or higher, the camera doesn't need as much light. So what does that mean? Why would you use a lower ISO setting anyway? Why not always just shoot an ISO 800 or 1600, because you just don't need as much light. So if you have plenty of light, that's okay. Well, what you're going to find is that at lower values of ISO, you get better quality images. The camera essentially captures higher quality data at a lower ISO value. It's useful for shooting outdoors or with a bright flash. So you might need more light, but the quality of your picture is better. More information, more color information is captured in those lower ISO values. Once you start raising your ISO to 1600, 3200, the quality of the image that you get isn't as good, and you start seeing things like noise and grain in your photo, and we'll take a look at that in just a minute here. So if your quality of your images isn't as good at higher ISO values, then why even use them in the first place? Well, first of all, modern cameras are a lot better at higher ISO values. 5 years ago, shooting at ISO 3200 is pretty well unheard of. Now, any camera can shoot at ISO 3200 with decent results. Some can go as high as 6400. If you shoot full frame, you can go to 6400 pretty much no problem, and even beyond. Some cameras will shoot natively at ISO 12800, and you'll see a lot of digital SLRs with a value of high +1 or high +2. That means it artificially extends the sensitivity of the digital film. Sometimes you don't have enough light and you need you need your digital sensor to be more sensitive to light. So if you're shooting a birthday party and there's just not a lot of light around, you can either use a lower ISO value and use a flash to change the light that's available to force more light into the room, but then you get these harsh shadows and everything, or you can set it to a higher ISO value, 3200 let's say, and you still get a nice picture with the available light you have. Even though the quality of the image isn't as good, it's a trade-off that's worth making if you want to avoid using that flash. Let me see if I can explain this with an analogy. Let's say I've got a bucket, and in this bucket is some water. I want to pour 1 liter of water into this pot because I'm cooking something for dinner and I need a liter of water. Well, this water has some impurities in it. And I need to strain out those impurities in order to get my 1 liter of water in my pot here. So I need to figure out what strainer to use. I can use a strainer like this. That's very small. And this strainer is going to filter out all of the impurities as I pour this water through it, my virtual water here. You can imagine in your mind here, if I pour this bucket of dirty water through here, it's gonna filter out all of the impurities in the water, and I'm going to be left with really nice drinkable water that's good for cooking. But it's going to take longer to get that 1 liter of water into my pot, so I have to sit and pour for a little while longer because there's so much stuff in that water. My end result will be better, but it's going to take longer to get that liter of water. So I can increase my ISO value, essentially. I can increase the size of the holes in my strainer. If I use a strainer like this, it's not going to take as long to get that 1 liter of water into my pot. This would be like ISO maybe 800 or 1600, whereas the first one would be ISO 100 or 200. If I wanted to get that liter of water really fast, I could use a strainer with an ISO value of 6400 and pour that water right through. But the problem is you're going to get a lot of impurities in that water when you go to cook the food. Sure, you're going to get your 1 liter of water nice and quickly, but it's going to be filled with a lot of junk. It's going to be filled with a lot of, in film terms, noise and grain, and the quality of the water isn't going to be as good. That's how ISO works. When you increase the ISO, sure, you don't need to leave your shutter open as long to capture the available light, but the quality of your image isn't going to be as good. So how do you know which ISO to use? It depends on the photo that you want to take. Noise and grain aren't always bad, keep in mind, and sometimes the sacrifice we make is worth it, depending on the photos that we want to get. So if you're taking a low light photo, maybe it's worth it to you to have a noisy photo if it means you can get the shot in the first place. Generally, it's a good idea to just up the ISO if it means you're going to get the shot. So if you're going to get a nice clean shot, but you have to use ISO 6400 to do it, it might be worth it if it's a fast-moving subject or something like that. You use a lower ISO value, and you're going to have to leave your shutter open for a longer time. So even though your image might not be as noisy or grainy, you won't get the image you want. It'll be blurry. And some cameras are better than others. So if you've got a smaller camera, like an iPhone or a point and shoot, they're going to be more grainy at the higher ISO values because the size of that sensor, that digital sensor, is not very big. If you've got a digital SLR, it's got a bigger sensor, or even a Micro Four Thirds, or if you got like a Sony NEX5 or NEX7, those use the same size digital film as an SLR. The chip in it is a lot bigger, and so it can collect a lot more light. And if you got a full frame camera, like I mentioned earlier, it's just going to be a lot cleaner in general. The larger pixels on the film itself mean it's going to capture more data and less noise. In general, if you're outdoors and there's plenty of light, it's a nice sunny day, you can use a lower ISO value of 100, 200, or 400. You're going to get a nice clean image. That shutter is going to be open just a fraction of a second in order to get all the available light into your camera sensor, even though it's being processed through a really fine strainer like that. If you're indoors, a higher ISO value, 1600, 3200, maybe even 6400, depending on the type of camera you have and the type of picture you want to take. But just because you can boost your ISO doesn't mean you should. There's other things you can do in order to get that photo. One thing you can do if you don't have it is buy a prime lens. So this lens is a 35mm prime lens. That means that it only has one focal length, 35. It doesn't zoom in and out, but the trade-off is the opening in the lens is really big. It's got a really wide aperture in it. So if I'm in a low light situation like a birthday party that we keep using as our comparison here, I don't need to necessarily go clear to ISO 6400. Maybe I can shoot at ISO 1600, but the opening in this lens is so big that it lets in plenty of light. If you've got a zooming lens, like the lens that came with your camera, chances are it doesn't have as big of an opening. And one thing you can do if you want to get those cleaner photos without having to go to ISO 6400 is maybe pick up a prime lens like this. You can also lengthen the amount of shutter time, or the amount of time your shutter is open. So instead of your shutter being open for 1/60th of a second, you can leave it open for 1/30th or 1/10th of a second. You're going to find, though, if you have moving subjects, if there's people in your photo, that 1/10th of a second is going to be a lot of blurry motion. So unless your subjects are holding really still, leaving your shutter open a long time to get a cleaner photo might not be the best idea. So let's take some example photos and see what happens to the quality of the photo when we shoot from lower to higher ISO values. So I've got my tripod here and my camera is aimed at some pens on the desk. So we're going to take the exact same photo, only at different ISO values. And we're going to talk about what happens here. So here we've got 5 photos taken at different ISO values, and other than that, they're identical. In fact, I shot these in program auto mode, which meant that I changed the ISO, but the camera adjusted other settings in order to maintain the same exposure. What that means is they're all about the same level of brightness. You can see that here in the end one, even though I used an ISO value of 6400, it's about the same level of brightness as the beginning one, ISO value of 200, where it wasn't very sensitive to light. So they maintained about the same exposure, and there's some variations here and there. The end one, the 6400 one, is maybe a little brighter, or maybe the 200, maybe we could say is slightly underexposed, but other than that, they're pretty similar photos. So what effect did it really have to change the ISO values, and why might we want to do that? Well, let's take a closer look here. We'll start with the ISO 200. This photo here, ISO 200, you can see is nice and clean. It's got a nice depth of field, which means that the front things are in focus and the back things aren't. Our eyes are really drawn to this nice blue pen in the front and the black pen. And we can see the yellow pencil or the orange pencil sticking up there too. And everything's really nice and clean and crisp. Also, the colors of the background here, this is really nice smooth gradation from yellow to darker yellow, almost brown here. And same here, this is nice smooth gray, black colors here. As we move up the line to ISO 400, not a whole lot changes. It's still really nice and sharp. You have good colors, not a lot of noise or grain. And I'm going to show you what this whole noise and grain thing is about. I didn't do 800 because it looks pretty similar to 400 in this, and I don't want to belabor the point too much. Here we've bumped up 2 stops from 400. We've bumped up to ISO 1600. A couple things are happening here. First of all, to the naked eye, this might look about the same until you really start doing what they call pixel peeping and zooming in close to look at things on a pixel by pixel level. But for the casual observer, 1600 might look just fine. And again, this all goes back to what you want to take, the photo you want to take. Maybe for your purposes, ISO 1600 is fine. And maybe if you're the kind of person who really likes to zoom in and look at really small magnifications of these, or really small areas magnified huge, maybe 1600 is not what you want. But again, it's different strokes for different folks here. ISO 1600, we can see that we don't have quite as shallow of a depth of field. More things are in focus. If I go back here to 200, you'll notice right here on the container itself, a lot of things in focus here on the 1600, and I go back to 200, it's really just this top part here that's in focus. And in order to do that, at ISO 1600, what happened is the camera is getting so much more sensitive to light that it had to compensate by closing down the aperture. If we look here, this photo was actually shot at an aperture of 1.8, which means it's a huge aperture. And that means it's a shallower depth of field. This one, ISO 1600, it was shot at an aperture of 2.8, so the aperture is smaller, which means more things are in focus. And if we look, we can start to see some grain across this color here. It's not a nice smooth color gradation like it was in the 200 version. And same over here. Let's go up to 3200, and you could probably guess what's going to happen. Sure enough, we're seeing a lot more grain and noise here in these color gradations, and same over here. And with 6400, it's pretty noticeable even without pixel peeping, without really zooming in. You can kind of see just at first glance there's a lot more grain and noise. And if I go back and compare this to the 200, you'll notice right away a big difference. This one's much smoother, much more natural and realistic. And this one, it just looks like it's a little noisy, a little grainy, a little dirty. And again, that's not a bad thing depending on what you want to take a picture of. If it's a low light scenario, maybe the only thing you can do is bump the ISO. Also, in order to maintain the proper exposure at this ISO 6400, if we look here, this was shot at an aperture value of f4, meaning it's a much smaller aperture. The film was so sensitive to light that the camera had to control for it by shrinking the aperture. In other words, not letting as much light in because it was using a piece of film, a digital film, that was so sensitive. So in order to maintain this same exposure, make sure this picture looked pleasing in terms of nothing was too bright or too dark, it had to compensate by not letting in as much light because it was using a strainer from before. We use our analogy from before that was filled with such big holes, it was letting a lot through. Let's zoom in here though and really get a good comparison. If we zoom in on this pencil, we can read these words. They're nice and clear and in focus, as well as the barcode on this pen here. And the colors are really nice and smooth. And we can look all over here. The colors here, this ISO 200, this color from the corner is really nice and smooth. But if we compare this version, if we zoom in on the pencil to the 3200 version, you can see a big difference. This pencil, you can still read the words, it's still nice and sharp, but the color is not as crisp. It's noisy. We can see these little specks all over in this color and the color of this pencil. Compare that again to the 200 version. Nice and clean, a lot of specks, a lot of noise. Now let's go clear up to 6400. This is really noisy, really grainy. And we can see that the colors down here in the corner are not nearly as smooth. Look at this. It's just full of noise and static almost. If we compare that to the 200, really nice and smooth here. And 64, not so much. So you can see what's happening as we're increasing our ISO, where some of these trade-offs are happening. Here's another thing though. If we look at our highlight areas, in other words, the areas that are clipped because they're too bright or too dark. In this case, there's an area of this photo that's just too bright. If we look at on the 200, if we look at highlight hot and cold areas, we see these red areas here are too bright. They essentially no color data was captured for this red area here. There's we say it's been blown out. So what that means is I can go in post-production in my program here of Aperture and adjust the levels of things. I can pull the whiteness of this down. I can do a lot of room. I have a lot of room to edit this photo in post-production. Except for these red areas. I can't do much about these red areas. They're the overexposed. They're the clipped areas. Not a lot of the data there is essentially useless. And watch as I increase the ISO values, that area becomes larger and more pronounced. So here's 200, 400, we're starting to lose a lot of data. 1600, 32, and 64, we lose a ton of data. So we can't get that back. This is another advantage of shooting at lower ISO. You actually have more data to work with in post-production. So, and these are all shot in RAW, which means I can go and edit the colors a lot and edit the photo a lot, but not at a higher ISO. Remember back to that bucket analogy. The higher ISO, the 6400, it's letting in, you might say that it's letting in a lot of garbage, and the sensor is not doing, it's so sensitive that it's picking up a lot of stuff that we might not even want. And the quality of our light, the quality of the image that we're getting is not as good. And we can see that quantitatively here. We're losing a lot of data because we go to ISO 6400. Whereas 200, get a nice clean shot. But one thing to remember is that your photos aren't always going to be examined on a pixel level. If we take off our highlight and hot and cold areas here, and we scroll through these photos again, even though we're making some trade-offs here to go to higher ISOs, this 6400 on this particular camera, this Nikon D7100, still looks pretty good. And to the casual observer, this photo might look just fine. So given your particular photography goals and what you're trying to accomplish with your photo, ISO 6400 might work. ISO 200 might work. It all depends on what you want to take and the type of photo that you're going for. The bottom line here is that in order to take good photos, you need to know what ISO is and how to use it, as well as the limit of your camera. It's going to vary depending on the camera you've got, and lens you've got, and the type of photo you want to take. but know your limits. Go out and practice shooting at different ISO values and see what it does to your photo. Pull your photos up in an editor like Aperture or Lightroom or Photoshop and look at them and see if maybe to you it's acceptable to have higher grain. Also, software today is a lot better at eliminating some of that noise and grain. And remember, it's not always a bad thing to have noise and grain in your photo. Sometimes it can be a nice, pleasing artifact depending on the type of photo that you want to take. What do you need to use to get the shot that you want to take? And that all depends on the equipment you have and what your goal is in mind is for the photo that you want. Now, one thing to note though is many cameras today have auto ISO. What that means is that you can tell the camera what's the slowest shutter speed to use, i.e. don't go any slower than this, don't leave it open for any longer than this, at which you need to start adjusting the ISO automatically. So if you want to not really worry about the ISO, first of all, you can put your camera in auto mode and it'll take care of all of it for you. But I generally don't recommend using auto mode because the camera doesn't know what you know about the photo you want to take. But you can tell your camera that when it starts to reach slower values like a 60th of a second or a 30th of a second, instead of going slower than that, start bumping up the ISO to compensate in order to get the photo that you want to take. Auto ISO is really useful, but again, know the limits of your camera. When I use auto ISO, which I don't use all the time, but if I do use it, I tell my camera don't go above 3200 because beyond that, I don't really want to, I don't want to trust the camera to go past that because it doesn't know the kind of photo I want to take. Sometimes I'll go to 4000 or 6400 depending on the photo I want to take, but the camera doesn't know what I want to take. So if I'm using auto ISO, I generally don't go beyond 3200. Also, I would avoid using high +1 or high +2 if your camera has auto ISO. If you're getting into that territory, get some more light. There's really not a good reason to use high +1 or high +2. And also, using those isn't really any different than just going into Lightroom and bumping up the exposure manually. It's essentially the same thing. It's kind of a marketing gimmick, really, when you see cameras advertised as has ISO expanded range of 25,600, something like that. That expanded range is just a bullet point. It's not really practical use. And if you're shooting at 25,600 ISO expanded range, your photo's not going to look very good anyway. The bottom line when this is all said and done is it's the third triangle, or it's the third element of the exposure triangle between aperture and shutter value, then ISO. So you need to know what it is and play around with it, have fun shooting, just experiment with it for a while and see what happens when you start changing different ISO values. As a final note, if you're not sure how to do it and your camera isn't responding when you press those buttons, and every camera is different, you might be in a manual mode. If you're used to or you might be in an auto mode. If you're used to shooting in auto mode, put it in P mode. And your camera, if it has a dial like this, I suppose this might be upside down, but if your camera has a dial like this, you'll see it has MASP, or it might say TV, AV, P, and M, depending on if you've got a Canon or a Pentax or another type of camera. P is programmed auto. It's more flexible than the regular auto, the green auto button. So if you're looking to adjust some of this stuff manually, try putting it in P for programmed auto. That'll let you adjust the ISO while the camera still figures out the rest. I recommend shooting in one of the manual modes like full manual to really get your hands dirty with what all this exposure stuff means. Or at least aperture priority is shutter priority. But if you've never shot in that before and you just want to get your feet wet with some of this ISO business, try programmed auto and see what you think. If you have any questions, let me know. Leave them in the comments section, and good luck and have fun shooting.